Okay, welcome back, and what we're going to do, at least for this first part of this week, is to look at a short video on Phoenician history. So what you see here on this scene is a map of what we would call the Middle East. You can see Egypt down at the bottom, you can see the Black Sea up at the top, and just below the Black Sea is a map of modern-day Turkey, where you find some of the Hittites, which are colored sort of greenish blue. And then in between Egypt and the Hittites, this is where the Phoenicians are. And you can see a few cities on this map. You can see Tyre, you can see Byblos, you can see Dor. So those are important Phoenician cities. And one thing to note here, these are city-states. So remember the definition of a city-state. It's separate government, separate military, separate economy. And these Phoenician city-states really suffered because of their form of government, because what you find is that the Hittites up here were actually going to war with Egypt for a good part of the time. And of course, the one way that these great nations could get to each other was through the Phoenician city-states. So every once in a while the Phoenician city-states would get together, form a little confederacy, but usually it was too late. And the Phoenicians really didn't thrive until you have a breakdown in both Egypt and the Hittite area. All right, so a little bit about the Phoenicians. So as I mentioned, they have city-states. You find the first villages growing into cities around 2500 BC, and as I just mentioned, in the early part of Phoenician history, they had a really difficult time because they were constantly being invaded by both the Egyptians and the Hittites, and in particular, between 1800 BC and 1400 BC, Phoenician territory is essentially Egyptian. So the Egyptians take over this area, and the Egyptians play a really big role in sort of keeping down the Phoenicians. Once the Phoenicians were free of Egyptian rule, starting around 1400 BC, this is when they really sort of come into their own. And they become very famous and very wealthy because of the direction that they went. So if you remember that map that I just showed you, you've got Egypt to the south, you've got the Hittite kingdoms up in the north. To the east, you've got deserts, and then beyond that, you've got Mesopotamia. So the Phoenicians really didn't have a space to expand except for along the Mediterranean. So what they do is they build their ships, and then they become a seafaring people. Now, they made quite a bit of money on material that they made and then shipped throughout these regions. So one was purple dye. And most of the purple dye was made out of seashells. And purple was a royal color. So it was a color that in some civilizations you could not wear unless you were part of the royal family. Another thing that they became famous for was glass. And either this week or when we get to the Roman period, I will have a podcast just on glass making. But you find Phoenician glass all over the Mediterranean during this period. And probably one of the most famous materials that they traded with were the cedars of Lebanon. And you find, even going back to Gilgamesh, which was written probably around 2700 BC, mentioning these famous trees. And if you live in the western part of the country, and if you're going to build a fence, you usually build it out of cedar or redwood. And the reason for that is because it's rot resistant. Another thing about cedar is that it smells really good. So the Egyptians really like that for decorating objects, burning incense, and so on. And of course, Egypt doesn't have forests, so they needed large trees. And this was a place where they ended up getting them. And Mesopotamia, exactly the same thing. Another thing the Phoenicians are famous for is that during this big seafaring period, they were setting up colonies. And these colonies became trading posts. So one really important thing to remember is that you've got the Greeks, and I know I haven't talked about Greek history yet, you have the Greeks going out into colonies as well, and the Phoenicians and the Greeks meet up, and something very famous happens. The thing that happens that's very famous is that the Greeks, during their Dark Age, which lasts from about 1100 to about 800 or 900 BC, totally forgot to write. Now, it just so happens that the Phoenicians could write. And so during this colonization process, the Phoenicians and the Greeks come together. The Greeks borrow the they borrow the Phoenician alphabet. And what I've given you here is sort of the timeline of how the alphabet that you're probably taking notes in came down to us. So it was adopted by the Greeks, spread to the Etruscans, who are northern Italians, spread to the Romans, and then it was passed down to us. And then this is the last slide on Phoenician history, and you don't have to remember all of this. The reason I wanted to put this up on the slide is because I wanted to sort of impress upon you how difficult it is for a civilization to advance when they're controlled by outside forces. So as I put up here, and you already know this, Egypt controlled Phoenicia for about 400 years, and then that stopped when the Egyptians had a collapse and the Hittites were collapsing. Unfortunately for the Phoenicians, you have the rise of the Assyrians, and they took over. Then you've got the rise of the Persians, and they take over Phoenicia to about 330 BC. And then you've got the Greeks invading with Alexander the Great. And he conquers these people, and you really don't have Phoenician city-states by the time you get down to Rome. So when the Romans come in and take over this territory, which is around 63 BC, the Phoenicians have vanished. So things to remember about the Phoenicians: they were great seafarers. They did a lot with trade. And of course, our alphabet we use today comes down from them.